What do these little nuggets of grain have to do with your pint? Let's go find out. Hi, I'm Joanne, the beer school lady, and I teach beer lovers how to taste beer with confidence and develop their knowledge of the world's favourite beverage. So, as you may or may not know, there are 4 main ingredients to beer: water, hops, yeast and malt. Now, when we say malt, we generally mean malted barley, but there can be other grains involved as well. The grains within that malt bill, which is the list of malts that a brewer decides to add to a beer, add not only colour, flavour and aroma, but they also add the fermentable sugars that yeast needs to be able to create alcohol and carbon dioxide. So malt is the backbone of your beer. When we say malt, we generally mean barley, but you can also get malted wheat and oats. You can also have other grains that are unmalted, such as rye, spelt, corn, rice or sorghum, which is a grain that's often used in African brewing. This can be malted or unmalted. Unmalted grains don't add the same fermentable sugars. Grains that don't add fermentable sugars are considered adjuncts, but they can still be important in a beer recipe. As a quick recap on how beer is brewed, the grain is steeped in hot water to extract starches and enzymes that produce the fermentable sugars needed to create alcohol and carbon dioxide. That sticky liquid is then called wort. It is boiled and hops and other ingredients are added to it. The wort is then cooled down and yeast is pitched into it. That then eats the sugars that are available and creates alcohol and our beloved beverage of beer. The more malt used in a recipe, the higher possibility of a high ABV. So if you've ever seen a dipper and a tipper and heard anybody say that it's the hops that add the alcohol, this is not correct. The alcohol is added by the fermentable sugars from the malt and yeast doing its job. Our malt is put into 2 different categories: base malts and specialty malts. Our base malts make up the most of the grain bill. That's the list of grains that a brewer is going to use in their beer recipe. Base malts are less lightly toasted and can produce more fermentable sugars. That's why they make up the majority of the grain bill. You then get specialty malts. These can be toasted, roasted and stewed and will add interesting colours and flavours to your beer. You only want a little bit of these to create these aromas and flavours, and it is the skill of the brewer that creates the interesting things that you drink from your glass. But how is malt produced? I'm going to refer to barley a lot in this section, but other grains can be used. So the barley is harvested and then it's dried. The kernels are then soaked to start the germination process. This wakes up enzymes that we need to convert starches into fermentable sugars, so it's really important. The barley kernels are allowed to sprout. This is then stopped by a process called kilning, where the grains are heated and toasted to different levels. Remember our base malts and our specialty malts. At this point, the maltster, isn't that a great name for a job? They know exactly how much heat and air to apply to the grains and for how long to produce different types of base and specialty malts. This is called kilning, and the colour of the grain may change. Kilning doesn't cook the grains, however, it just toasts them. If they were cooked, that would get rid of the starches that we need to produce fermentable sugars. This is where that division between base malts and specialty malts come in. Darker malts are kilned for a very long time and are almost roasted. They can look like roasted coffee beans. A lot of the starches have therefore been killed off by this process, so they're not going to produce very many fermentable sugars. This is why your base malts are much more lightly kilned. This allows the most amount of starches to survive to create fermentable sugars. We do want a mixture of these processes, however, to produce the greatest range of flavours and aromas that we can. But what about the history of malting? When malts were first produced, the grains were put in sacks in rivers to start the germination process. They would then have to be dried over wood fires because that's all that was available. A lot of beers back in history would have had smoky notes to them. There also wasn't a high volume of malt that could be produced because the results were inconsistent. This all changed in 1818, however, when a man called Daniel Wheeler invented the drum roaster. He had seen how coffee was roasted and developed the same technology for malt. This allowed for new malts to be created. Much paler malts were possible and much darker ones as well. With new malts came new beer styles, and some of the beers that we enjoy today are due to this technological advance. This pale malt here is Maris Otter. It is a base malt. This is going to give you lots of lovely fermentable sugars but a paler colour. This is malted wheat. Wheat is used in hazier beers. The protein from wheat creates the haze, and it also adds a really nice mouthfeel. Now, we didn't talk about how caramel malts are produced. This here is some Cara Munich malt. These are done in a slightly different way. The grains are stewed before they are kilned. This creates sugar crystals in the grains. You might be able to see the darker chunks in these grains there. These sugar crystals dissolve in the water when the mash is happening and add caramel flavours and colours. Our final malt here is chocolate malt. This is not the darkest malt that you can get. That is patent black malt. These are highly roasted. You don't want to add too much of this because it will add astringency to your beer, but it will add lovely chocolate and coffee flavours and a really dark colour. So malt is not only responsible for the alcohol levels and flavours and aromas, it's also responsible for the colour of your beer. Beer colour is measured on the SRM scale, which is the standard reference method. This ranges from the lightest coloured beers, think about your very light pilsners, which are 1 to 2 on the SRM scale, all the way up to your darkest black imperial stouts, which are 40 plus on the SRM scale. The grain bill is often the most complex part of the beer recipe. Brewers can use a single malt in their beer, or they can use a combination of as many as they like. I've heard 10 plus different malts mixed together to create what is in your glass. Really, brewing beer is an art as well as a science. As a beer lover, being able to describe malts, flavours and aromas is going to be really useful to you. If you want to know more about describing beer, check out the video that's on your screen now. I'll also be adding to this series about beer ingredients, so make sure that you're following Love Beer Learning to see about hops, yeast and water.